Abe, thank you very, thank you very much for jumping in there, Gabe.
Yeah, no problem. And yeah.
Sorry, I had to pick up that call, but I just wanted to welcome everyone also on behalf of EC3. Thank Benjamin. My name is Sue Ditta, and I'm the Executive Director of EC3. And for those of you who don't know, EC3 does professional development workshops all during the year on a whole wide variety of topics, but this was an eagerly anticipated one because this legislation has been in progress for about 10 years and just recently received royal assent, and now is something that we all need to know more about in order to do our jobs well as art managers and administrators and board directors, whether we live in Peterborough or in Sault Ste. Marie. So thanks to Gabe for making this happen, and to Benjamin for being here to present today.
And I'll just provide a bit of an introduction on Benjamin as well, and then we'll let him take it from there. Benjamin Miller is a staff lawyer at the Nonprofit Law Ontario Project of Community Legal Education Ontario, or CLEO, where he focuses on nonprofit and charity law and policy. Over the past 4 years at CLEO, Benjamin has answered hundreds of nonprofit law questions and developed an online interactive bylaw builder for the ONCA, which is a very useful tool. I've played around with it a little bit. Benjamin also works at the Ontario Nonprofit Network and has worked at the Canada Revenue Agency in the past. Benjamin holds a JD and MPP from the University of Toronto and an MA in political theory from the University of Ottawa. And so I will let Benjamin take it from here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me, and to all the people who stayed. Hopefully it remains fresh and as exciting as I'm sure everybody loves ONCA. Hopefully, at the very least, I'll be able to provide some reasons to motivate you to engage with it. You don't have to love it at the end of the day, but at least get to a place where you can deal with it in a way that it feels productive and valuable to your organization. So my presentation will cover 3 areas: what's new in the ONCA, some of the bigger ticket items. Number 2, what steps nonprofits need to take to get in compliance with the ONCA. And number 3, how can CLEO help? Some of our free resources. Gabe already mentioned the bylaw builder, and there are a few others. So hopefully there'll be time at the end. I'll give you a bit of a tour of our website. I'm from Community Legal Education Ontario, and in case you don't know, CLEO is a legal clinic, part of Ontario's legal aid system. But unlike other legal aid clinics that do one-on-one legal advice and services, CLEO specializes in creating plain language, clear design, legal information, and education. My corner of CLEO is a very small corner. We've got resources on other areas that might be of interest to you: employment law, discrimination, social assistance, housing, etc. So I encourage you to check out some of our websites, stepstojustice.ca being just one of the cooler ones, in my opinion. A few housekeeping. So Gabe already mentioned, if you could ask in the chat, I'll just add in the 3 sections of the presentation, there will be a period of time at the end of each section where I'll pause for questions. I will note, however, that if you have a clarifying question in the meantime, so you don't understand a word I'm using or something, it's best for us to nip that in the bud, answer it as soon as possible. So please ask it when the question occurs to you, and I'm sure will unmute and then ask me the question then. I do not mind being interrupted. A few disclaimers. Number 1, this is general legal information. It's not legal advice. Number 2, this is a high-level overview of the ONCA, so it's not going to be comprehensive here today. It's just the big ticket items. Our website has a lot more details, so I encourage you to go there. And I'm not going to be talking about other areas of law you might be interested in, such as charity law. I'm happy to take questions. In the last session, we got into some detail, but that will really be driven by your questions. I'll only touch on it in the presentation. Number 3, this is about law and not best practices. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's a good idea. I'm here to highlight options for you. I'm not here to tell you what's the right choice in your case, which may vary. And finally, this is about law and not about your funders' expectations. In particular, when we talk about financial review standards, it's going to take some time for funders to decide whether they want their expectations to track the new flexibilities under the ONCA. I want to acknowledge the land that I'm coming to you from. I'm in downtown Toronto, the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and it's now home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis relatives. And I want to explicitly acknowledge my privilege as well as my role in systems of colonization. So for those who were on the earlier session, you heard a bit about this, what it means in particular in the case of nonprofit corporate law, but I'll reiterate for those who are joining us. Number one, corporate law has and continues to be used as a vehicle to evade responsibility for harms done as a part of colonization. And number two, the standards for governance by ONCA and corporate legislation can displace traditional or alternative forms of governance. So I will invite, as I did before, I will invite you to ask questions if you're feeling tensions between what the corporate law requires of you and your desire to develop governance systems that are more accountable as part of the reconciliation process or otherwise. CLEO staff are learning to be better allies by participating in training about the systemic nature of anti-Indigenous racism, and we're trying to sensitize the information we give to the experience and the wisdom of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So as part of that, I want to kind of set the stage for our discussion of the details of ONCA with a contrast between two sets of treaties that govern the land where I am. On the one hand, the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and on the other, the Treaty 13. So we talked a bit in the last session about the Dish with One Spoon, but in this session, I'm going to compare and contrast a bit. So on the left, you see pictured a wampum belt. So the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement, a resource sharing agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples to govern this area, manifests itself in belts like this, intricately woven belts of shells that are presented at important events by a messenger, and the belt speaks through the messenger, who reiterates the terms, the growing terms of the relationship between the parties at each subsequent event. Contrast that with Treaty 13, the so-called Toronto Purchase, the first attempt at which was made in 1787. And by 1805, the colonial authorities were so disturbed by its questionable legality that they went looking for the document. Note, they didn't know where it was. So they went looking for it, and they found one copy in, I believe, literally a shed somewhere. And it was a blank deed with signatures on other pieces of paper that were attached to that deed. These two sets of treaties, to me, embody two ideals of what it means to comply with the law and what good governance looks like. And unfortunately, while I think nonprofits, what it means to comply with the ONCA as well as any other set of law more closely resembles the wampum belt, it's not just about updating your documents and filing them away. It's about, are you living by the ideals set out in your governing documents? Unfortunately, too often, I mean, nonprofits that more closely resemble the Treaty 13 way of approaching the law. The rules set out in their documents don't necessarily reflect the practices on the ground. So for me, at least, one way of honoring the wisdom of the treaties, particularly when it comes to how our organizations engage in reconciliation, is having a more meaningful relationship to legal compliance, to actually embodying the ideals that we set out in our governing documents in our day-to-day practice. And I'll talk about practically what that means for the steps to actually comply with the ONCA. Before jumping into the details of the ONCA, there are a few terms I want to make sure we're all clear on. So firstly, the ONCA, what is it? It stands for Ontario's Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, which is a piece of legislation which replaces Ontario's Corporations Act. So it governs provincially incorporated nonprofits. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but it doesn't govern federally incorporated nonprofits. So if you're incorporated under Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, not for you, doesn't govern co-ops, doesn't govern business organizations that happen to be run on a nonprofit basis, and it doesn't govern unincorporated organizations unless they want to become incorporated. So I'll be using the term ONCA throughout. Letters patent. So what is a letters patent? A letters patent is that document that the government first sent you when you first got incorporated. It includes important information such as your purposes, your address, your founding directors, and other special provisions that you may have added at the time of incorporation. The way to change it is by filing what are called articles of amendment now with the government. Contrast that with your other governing documents, which you may call bylaws or constitution, which contain your governance rules and only require the approval of sometimes your board, but always your membership. So the difference between your letters patent, now called articles under ONCA, is that you need to file something with the government and get the approval of the government, whereas your bylaws or your constitution, or you may call it your governing rules, they set out the actual operations of your governance, and they only need the approval of your directors and your members. So that's the difference between those two documents, and we'll talk about how you need both to update to get in compliance with the potentially. The third term that I want to clarify is members. Nonprofits use the term member to refer to all kinds of things. So you could have the members of your board, the members of your theater troupe or your orchestra. You could have the members such as your monthly donors. It's fine to use the word members for all those purposes. But for our purposes here today, and legally speaking, members are those people that are set out in your governing documents, so your bylaws and maybe your articles, as the people who have governance rights, such as the right to attend members' meetings, or you may call them AGMs, annual general meetings, the right to receive certain documents, financial documents, the right to appoint auditors, the right to elect directors, and so on. You can have non-voting members, but your governing documents will say, these people are members, or some analogous term. They just don't have the right to vote. So your governing documents are going to say who your members are. If they don't say who your members are, the default rule is in your letters patent, your founders are your first members. So if it doesn't say anywhere else who your members are, I guess they're your members, which can lead to problems if they've died or you can no longer get in touch with them. So I can take questions about that. But we're going to talk a lot about members throughout. Okay, why care about the ONCA? So I recognize people have diverse reasons for being in the room today. Some of you may be excited, a chance to look at your governance, to renew your organization. Some of you may just understand it's one more thing we need to do. Some of you may be intimidated or anxious. So here are a few reasons why this might be a good opportunity for your organization. So number one, regardless of what the ONCA actually requires you to do, the process of updating your governing documents for the ONCA presents an opportunity for you to take a look at the rules that apply to you, to take a look at your purposes and ask yourself, does this still make sense for us? So that's number one, could be a good opportunity. Number two, some new things are possible under the ONCA. There are new flexibilities around financial review, new flexibilities around how you structure your board and your officers and your membership and so on. So you may be interested in taking advantage of some of those new opportunities. Number three, your funders may ask you, are you compliant with the ONCA? Do you have plans on transitioning to the ONCA? And for them, it could just be a signal that you have your act together. Not exactly a reason to get excited, but a reason you might want to take notice of the ONCA. Number four, to avoid confusion later on. So I'll explain a bit more detail later on about this, but basically on October 19th, 2021, the ONCA took effect. However, nonprofits have a 3-year period in which their existing letters patent and governing documents, such as their bylaws, the rules in them continue to apply, even if those rules don't comply with ONCA, as long as they were valid before ONCA. So basically, you don't need to worry about updating for at least 3 years, which raises the question, what happens at the end of the 3 years? On October 19th, 2024, you don't need to worry about disappearing as an organization. That's not what's going to happen. What the law will consider you to have automatically transitioned. So any rules that you have, almost any rules, I'll talk about the exceptions a bit later. Most of your rules that are not compliant with the ONCA will automatically be considered to comply with the ONCA. What that means in practice is that your documents won't say what your actual rules are. That's going to be super confusing for a number of nonprofits. So to avoid that confusion, it's probably a good idea to take an interest in the ONCA within sometime over the next 3 years. Here's one reason you don't need to care about the ONCA. There are no ONCA police. No one is going to kick down your door from the government and ask you, are you complying with the ONCA? That is nobody's job in the government. The way the ONCA is structured, as far as enforcement is concerned, is your directors and members have rights to enforce the ONCA by taking your organization to court. So, you know, a lot of things have to break down first before your directors and members are willing or feel the need to do that. But it's not a question of the government will come and randomly audit you. If you're a charity, the CRA may take an interest, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But for the average nonprofit that's not a charity, it's nobody's job to police them other than their members, whose job it is to hold them to account. Okay, so let's jump into the details. Section 1, what's new in the ONCA? I'm going to talk about three kind of big ticket items. Number 1, what's a public benefit corporation? Number 2, financial review standards. And number 3, the Ontario Business Registry, which is this new technology that accompanies the ONCA. Okay, so the public benefit corporation. I apologize in advance. This is the most complicated part of my presentation. I start with it because it sets up some things later on. Under Ontario Corporations Act, all nonprofits face the same rules. Under ONCA, by default, all nonprofits face the same rules, but then there's this group that faces some additional rules. That group is called public benefit corporations. So that raises 2 questions. Question number 1, who's a public benefit corporation? And question number 2, what are these additional rules? So there are 2 ways that an organization can be a public benefit corporation. Way number 1, if you're a registered charity, you're automatically a public benefit corporation. Way number 2, if you receive more than $10,000 from either of the following sources in a given year, the next year you're a public benefit corporation, and that keeps on carrying over. So what are these sources? If you receive grants or financial assistance from government, so that means federal government, provincial government, municipal government, an agency of government such as the Ontario Trillium Foundation, then you would qualify as a public benefit corporation. Now, note here, it's grants or financial assistance. It does not include fees for service. Number 2, if you receive more than $10,000 in gifts or donations from sources other than members, directors, officers, or employees. So the idea here is that if you're getting money from the public, so the public might mean a foundation that isn't connected with you in some formal way, or it might mean just random members of the public, big donors, little donors. As long as it amounts to more than $10,000 in a given year, the next year you qualify as a public benefit corporation. So that's who's a public benefit corporation. Next, what are these additional rules that public benefit corporations have to follow? There are 3 big rules to keep in consideration. Number 1, public benefit corporations face higher standards of financial review. We'll discuss those on the next slide. Number 2, who they can distribute their property to if they ever dissolve. So dissolving means the nonprofit ceases to exist as a legal entity. So it dies basically for all legal purposes. The question is, if it has any property at the moment of its dissolution, who gets that property? So normally a nonprofit will have a line, it's called a dissolution clause, that will say if the organization ever dissolves, then such and such, this organization or these types of organizations or whatever will get our property. What does property mean? It means money, it means assets, etc. It's a very broad term. It's all the stuff you have. It includes intellectual property and so on. So who can get a public benefit corporation's property? Well, if you are a registered charity, then upon dissolution, your property can go to either government, federal, provincial, or municipal, or other registered charities. If you are a public benefit corporation that is not a charity, then your property can go to federal, provincial, municipal governments, or another public benefit corporation that has similar purposes, whether or not it's a charity. The third rule that public benefit corporations need to keep in mind is that they can have only up to 1/3 of their directors, and this includes ex officio directors, it includes non-voting directors, only up to 1/3 of their directors can be employees. Now, you may ask me, Benjamin, I didn't know employees could be directors at all. The answer is under nonprofit corporate law, they can. Doesn't mean it's a good idea. They still have to follow all the conflict of interest rules, but as long as you're not a charity, up to 1/3 of your directors can be, if you're a public benefit corporation. If you're not a public benefit corporation, there's no limit to how many of your directors can be employees. If you're a charity, there are additional complications to having employees as directors, and I can speak to those rules if somebody has a question. So that's public benefit corporations. Now we come to financial review standards. Under Ontario's Corporations Act, there was a fairly straightforward but inflexible rule. If you had annual income under $100,000, by default, you had to get an audit, but you could pass a resolution at your members' meeting to waive the audit. And then you could just do your financial review internally. If you had annual income above $100,000, you had to get an audit. So again, pretty simple, but not very flexible. Under ONCA, you have a more flexible rule, but a slightly more complex rule. By default, all nonprofits, whether they're public benefit corporations or not public benefit corporations, have to get an audit. But some nonprofits can, at their annual general meeting, so you may call it an AGM, your annual members meeting, these are different names for the same thing, at their annual members meeting can pass what's called an extraordinary resolution to either get a review engagement or a financial review, or to waive the audit altogether. That raises two questions. Number one, what's an extraordinary resolution? And number two, what's a review engagement or a financial review? And what's the difference between an audit and a review engagement? So an extraordinary resolution. A resolution is a motion, some kind of proposal at a members meeting. An ordinary resolution requires 51% support from the voting members who are voting at the meeting to pass. That's the default rule. Your bylaws can set a higher threshold, but by default, an ordinary resolution passes with a simple majority. That means 51%. An extraordinary resolution is a resolution that requires 80% or more in order to pass. So by default, organizations need to get an audit, but some nonprofits under ONCA can pass an extraordinary resolution at an annual members meeting to get a review engagement or waive external financial review altogether. So that's 80% or more. What's a review engagement? So an audit is where a public accountant comes in, looks at your source documents, so that means your receipts, your invoices, and so on, looks at your financial policies, like signing authorities, that kind of thing, looks at your financial statements that you prepared and says, I can provide reasonable assurance that your financial statements are a reliable reflection of your organization's financial position. Didn't see any material errors. Material error is an error that the accountant considers significant. That's an audit. A review engagement, or also known as a financial review, is faster, it's cheaper, but it's less extensive. So what's a review engagement? A review engagement is where the auditor, a public accountant comes in, looks at your source documents, looks at your financial policies, looks at your financial statements and say, okay, based on all this, I can say your financial statements are plausible. They're a plausible reflection of your financial position, meaning I didn't see any red flags that would cause me to doubt the financial statements. So, it's up to you whether that's appropriate for your organizations. Again, this is an area where your funders may have expectations that differ from the minimum the ONCA requires. So here's the key thing. Under $100,000, default, you get an audit, but you can pass an extraordinary resolution and you don't have to get any external review. If you're an organization with annual revenue between 100,000 and 500,000, if you're a public benefit corporation, default, you get an audit, but you can pass an extraordinary resolution and get a review engagement instead. If you're not a public benefit corporation, you can pass an extraordinary resolution and you don't even have to get a review engagement. If you have annual revenue above $500,000, then if you're a public benefit corporation, you have to get an audit. If you're not a public benefit corporation, you can pass an extraordinary resolution to have a review engagement. So you never have to get an audit according to ONCA if you're not a public benefit corporation. The last thing I'll note is the Ontario Business Registry. This is an evolving area because there are lots of glitches in the system. The benefit of the Ontario Business Registry is that it allows nonprofits to look themselves up online. You can see what your official purposes are, your official address on the government's files, who the government thinks your directors are, etc. You may not have updated yours recently. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation, ordering a corporate profile is a very good idea. So you know that they have the right people and address on file. And it will allow you to do things like update your articles, update your address faster, make various kinds of changes, etc. I'll talk more about this in the next section. Okay, so that's the end of section number 1. Are there any questions? Sue, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Hi, sorry about that. I did have a question about audits and financial reviews. When you said that you had to pass an extraordinary resolution, who has to pass that? The board? Does it have to be at an AGM, or can it be a percentage of the members at a special meeting?
So it is the members, it's not the board. It can be at a special meeting, but typically it would be at an annual meeting because typically that is the meeting where you would be required to appoint a new auditor. However, if your auditor quits or you're replacing them early for some reason, then a special meeting would be appropriate. But you don't have to call a separate special meeting. I'll also note, it's on the slide, though I didn't mention it, if you don't want to go to the whole trouble of calling a meeting and you have a small membership and they all agree, you can pass a written resolution signed unanimously by all members, so everybody has to agree to waive the audit. So you don't have to have the meeting, you could do it by a written resolution.
And my second question is related. You were mentioning that the terms and conditions of the Act kick in formally in 3 years. You have 3 years to make changes. Does that include the financial review?
So I'm going to nuance this a bit actually in step 2 of this part of the presentation, okay. but I'll say that, so there's a 3-year transition period in which your governing documents are still valid even if they contradict ONCA. However, if your governing documents are silent on an issue, so let's say they don't say anything specific about financial review, then it's the ONCA that applies. So that would include the flexibilities under financial review.
Okay, thank you very much.
Leslie.
I was just wondering about the public benefit corporations piece. In the last few years, I'm thinking that this number will increase because of the COVID support that different organizations will have received.
Yep.
Am I correct in that assumption that that's government assistance that would be included?
That is correct, and that was quite unintentional, and it's been a major issue for federally incorporated nonprofits or they have an equivalent concept called soliciting corporations, and lawyers have been talking with the government about doing some kind of carve out, and I don't know of any talks with the provincial government, but you are correct in identifying that, for example, loans that were made or rent relief, things like that, would qualify an organization under public benefit corporation.
Thank you.
So thank you for that question. Okay, so just being mindful of the time. So some details on the steps that you might need to take in order to comply with the ONCA. So step number one, figure out whether ONCA applies to you. So earlier I said it applies to provincial corporations, doesn't apply to federally incorporated organizations, co-ops, or businesses. I'll add two nuances here. So one, if you are subject to multiple acts and you feel there's a conflict between ONCA and the other act, ONCA yields, the other act wins. So don't be afraid of conflicts. It won't happen. ONCA is designed to yield. Number two, if you say, well, I'm a charity, does it apply to me? The answer is yes, if you're provincially incorporated. So ONCA is not about your charitable status. That's a tax matter, or it's about provincial charity law. ONCA is concerned with where you're incorporated. If you don't know where you're incorporated, there are two things you can look at: your letters patent, so that document the government sent you, or you can go on the Ontario Business Registry. So Google Ontario Business Registry, scroll down, it's the first result, and search the registry for your name. It's a bit finicky, so you might want to try a few variations and use your official name, not the name you go by in public, so the one on your official document, and then you can see if you're on the registry, you're provincially incorporated. So you find it does apply to you. What do you do next? You want to decide when. When do you want to act? So I've already mentioned there's this 3-year transition period. I already mentioned your old governing documents continue to be valid. If they're silent on an issue, ONCA is now the place you're going to find out what rule applies to you. There's an additional nuance that I would like to add now. I said at the end of 3 years, most of your rules automatically transition. There are a few exceptions where these rules will not change until you change your articles, another word for letters patent. What are those rules? Number one, the number of directors. So under ONCA, you are required to have a minimum of 3 directors. If your bylaws currently say that you have a board of 1 or a board of 2, you can keep that even past 3 years, as long as you don't make any other changes to your articles. Number 2, member classes and voting rights. ONCA requires nonprofits, if they have more than one type of member, to say what the different types of members are and their different voting rights in their articles. Under OCA, that would be specified in your bylaws. So if you have multiple types of members and different voting rights, and for whatever reason, you want to hold off on putting it in your articles. Remember, it's harder to change articles than it is to change your bylaws because you have to file things with the government. It also requires a 2/3 approval by your members. Bylaws, by default, only require 51% to change. So you do not have to put your multiple member classes and their voting rights in your articles until you make other changes to your articles. This is an area that could really trip people up, because if you make other changes to your articles and don't specify that you have multiple member classes, it's going to be a big question: who are your members? And so to avoid that whole confusion, make sure that you're looking at your membership when you're updating other things in your articles. Number 3, the dissolution clause. So this is that question of who gets your property if you end as an organization. So that doesn't automatically transfer at the end of 3 years. It only transfers once you make other changes to your articles. The takeaway here is that to avoid confusion, start looking at the ONCA sometime in the next 3 years, but it's not something that needs to be done by December 31st. Okay, so you've decided you want to take an interest in the ONCA. What are the documents you need to gather? And this is always a good idea to know where these documents are. You don't need to wait for the ONCA. Number one, your letters patent and any supplementary letters patent. A supplementary letters patent is if you ever made changes to your letters patent and filed it with the government would have issued you a supplementary letters patent. So you need to take your letters patent, your supplementary letters patent, bring them together, and then read them together to know what your rules are. Your bylaws or your constitution or your governing rules, whatever document sets out your governing rules, you want a copy of that. Number three, your minute books. So that includes minutes of the board, minutes of your members' meetings, minutes of committees of the board, and minutes of committees of members. ONCA requires you to keep those 4 types of minutes. And I'll address a few other points that I often get questions about. Number one, you can keep your records virtually, both minutes and other records. One of the nice things about ONCA is that it says you can keep these records virtually, and in fact, you can even keep them on the cloud. So OCA was silent about that. ONCA explicitly says you can keep your records outside of Ontario, and what that means in practice is the cloud, because as long as your records are accessible from your office or another place named by the board in Ontario. The other thing I'll note is that for in-camera minutes, because I often get questions about in-camera minutes, the nonprofit, when it comes to board meeting minutes and board committee meeting minutes, under ONCA, the only people with a right to see those documents are board members and auditors or financial reviewers, if they deem it necessary for their job, and court-appointed inspectors, which is a very, very rare case. So in practice, it's really the first two who have access to the board meeting minutes. So if you have an in-camera session and you don't want to release that to the public, and in practice you do make your minutes public, you should know that you have the option of saying in your bylaws either nothing, in which case they don't have access to those minutes, they don't have a right to access those minutes, or you can say that for in-camera minutes, it won't be shared with the public and so on. You will also want the text of special resolutions. These are resolutions that are passed by the members that require at least 2/3 support. So changes to your letters patent, such as changes to your purposes, changes to your if you amalgamated with another organization or so on, you would want the text of that because it would inform who it needs to comply with the ONCA and what your purposes are and so on. Directors and officers register. So ONCA requires that you keep a list of your directors and officers for going back at least 6 years. This register is just a list. That's just a fancy name for list. And it should have the names of your directors and officers, the start date, the end date, their address that they agreed to receive official documents at, and their email address if they agreed to receive documents electronically. A quick note of clarification, directors and officers are 2 separate things. They may be the same people in practice, but they're 2 separate roles. So for example, your members elect people to serve on the board, and they're all just called directors, and they exercise authority collectively. An officer is typically appointed by the board, so that may be a president, a secretary, a treasurer, and they exercise authority individually, and they have some specific mandate. So it may be the same people, but it doesn't have to be the same people, and it's 2 totally separate ideas, legally speaking. And you're required to keep a list of both. Director consent forms. So when does somebody become a director? It's not when you elect them director, because then you could elect anybody to be a director. It's when they agree to be a director in writing. So they say, you know, I so-and-so agree to be director of X organization as of X date. And for good measure, you'll want to include the address of that person so you know who you're talking about. And then a signature. So it doesn't have to be a fancy legalistic form. It just has to have that wording. CLEO's website includes some wording you can use. I get questions, does a code of conduct for directors count? It could, if it includes that wording. Does a confidentiality agreement count? It could, if it includes that wording. Does a nomination form count? It could, if it includes that wording. So you've got a lot of flexibility, but fundamentally you want that wording, who, their name, they agree to be a director of X organization as of X date, and their address for good measure, so you know who you're talking about. Organizations under ONCA are also required to keep a register of members. This is a list of members, their names, their start date, their end date, their address, and their email address if they agree to receive things electronically. Here, I would stress it's very, very important that the nonprofit find out that their address is correct with the government records. So go to the Ontario Business Registry, order a corporate profile, and see do they have the right address. The reason being, you're going to, if you want to access the Ontario Business Registry or file forms by mail, you're going to need what's called a company key. And the way to get a company key is to order one from the government, which will be sent to the address that they have on file. You cannot give them a PO box. You have to give them a physical address. I'll talk more about this soon. So sorry, just being mindful of time, Sue, I will address your question at the end after I've addressed the whole process. Okay, so how does somebody actually go about updating their bylaws and articles, and what needs to be filed with the government? So disclaimer, if your bylaws say a process, follow that process. The only part of this typical process that's absolutely a legal requirement is the members have to approve any changes to your bylaws. This is the typical process, though, if your bylaws don't say anything. So number one, the board approves. And the board can have any kind of process to initially propose and consider the bylaw changes. You could have a governance committee, you could have one person, you could have multiple people. What I would flag here is that in my experience, it's not a good practice to just give it to the one person that's a keener and is interested. It can be tempting, but because ultimately legal compliance is about living with your bylaws, you want more than one person to hold that knowledge and to have input into what the systems are actually going to be. So the board votes on it, and if they make changes to the bylaws, that change is valid up until the next members' meeting. The members' approval is required, and unless you have a unanimous resolution in writing, you need a valid members' meeting. What does it take to get a valid members' meeting? You need to notice that is given sufficiently in advance. Your bylaws may say how much notice is required. If not, ONCA says 10 to 50 days in advance, the notice has to come, and that notice has to provide sufficient detail for the voting members to be able to form a reasoned opinion about what they're voting on. At the members' meeting, the members then vote to approve, reject, or change the bylaws as was presented to them. Once the members approve the bylaws, then the bylaws are in effect for your organization. If you're voting on a change to your letters patent or your articles, the only difference, it's basically the same process, but you need a 2/3 support to pass it from the members. And the other difference is for bylaws, by default, nonprofits don't have to file that with government. If you're a registered charity, you have to file updated bylaws with the Canada Revenue Agency. But if you're not a registered charity, there's nobody the bylaws go to. Now, your funder may request them, but that's a separate consideration. Under ONCA, there's nobody you have to file them with unless you're a registered charity. Your articles do have to be filed with the government, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Here are a few things that you might need to or want to change in your bylaws. Number one, under the Ontario Corporations Act, you were required to appoint a president and a secretary. That's no longer required. You are, however, required to appoint a chair. So that might mean just changing the name for the same position, or it might mean a new position. You're still welcome to have president and secretary, you're just not required. The chair has to be a member of the board. Other officers don't have to be members of the board. Under ONCA, you can now have corporations be members of your organization. You might do this in order to have accountability to other organizations or as a fundraising device. There are many reasons you may not want it. If you want corporations to be eligible for membership, you have to explicitly say so in your bylaws. If you have multiple membership classes, so different types of members, Again, in your articles, you want to say what the different types are and their voting rights, but in your bylaws, you then have to say, how does somebody join a class? How does membership in that class end? How can somebody withdraw or shift between classes? By default, members controlling 10% of voting rights can go to the board and demand that a members meeting be called, and then the board has to call a members meeting unless certain special circumstances apply. Your bylaws can lower that threshold. So this may be a way to increase accountability to voting members. If you want your members to have a right to proxy voting, so proxy voting is where they have the power to appoint somebody to attend the meeting on their behalf and vote on their behalf. If you want your members to have the right to proxy voting, you have to explicitly say so in your bylaws. They do not have this right by default under the ONCA. Okay, articles. So there are two things I'm going to highlight about what you might want to change in your articles, and then I'm going to explain a bit about the company key. So number one, your purposes. So you may get your letters patent out, look at it and say, what, those are our purposes? That doesn't reflect what we do at all, right? It happens. I've seen it happen. ONCA doesn't require you to change your purposes, but especially if you're a charity or you're thinking of applying for charitable status, very important that your purposes reflect your activities and vice versa. So this could be a good opportunity while you're changing other things in your documents to update your purposes. If you are a registered charity or thinking of applying for charitable status, it would be a good idea to consult a lawyer to make sure your purposes are exclusively charitable. Numbers of directors. Under the Ontario Corporations Act, you could only say a fixed number, so 5, let's say, and you set it in your bylaws. Under ONCA, you have the flexibility of saying a range of directors, and then a board resolution fixes the number at every year. So this is great because it gives you more flexibility if you want that to, for example, respond to crises like COVID-19. So typically you might only require 5 and a realistic quorum is 3 for attending board meetings, but somebody comes along and they look like a good prospect. So you pass a board resolution, say this year it's 6. We have 6 seats on the board and so on. So that's a new flexibility that's available under the ONCA. Okay, so to file articles online, so once you've made the changes, to make them official, you need to file them with the Government of Ontario. You need 3 things. Services Ontario account, that's the same account you might use to access other services. A one key, if you're a transfer payment recipient or Grants Ontario recipient, it's going to be the same login information, and a company key. And the way you get the company key is by going to the Ontario Business Registry website and requesting them to send you one. It will be sent to your address, which is why it's so important that you check to make sure you have the right address on file. It's taking a long time, 4 to 5 weeks. And if they don't have the right address on file, the irony is the only way to change it is to go into the Ontario Business Registry, which requires a company key, or to mail something in, which requires a company key. So the only way to change your address if they have the wrong address on file is to pay a third-party provider who has direct access to the system. And those third-party providers are listed on the government website. It's a problem, and the Ontario Nonprofit Network, as well as others, are interfacing with the government to raise this issue. Yeah, that's how you do it. So I'm running out of time. I would like to give a quick tour of the website, but I'll take questions first. Sue?
Sorry, I have to go back and look and see what my question was. One of the things that you mentioned in both workshops was the importance of having an address and making sure the address was correct. But in one of your pieces of your presentation, you said that the law says that your meetings and activities have to go on at that address. And many organizations are working from home offices these days, and it probably will become permanent, and have meetings in all kinds of places around the city when in-person meetings are allowed and called for. How does the new law respond to that?
So just to clarify, the slide said by default, the law expects you to have meetings at that address. You are free to have, firstly, by default, you can have online meetings. So that's a rule, but you are free in your bylaws to say other locations. And it's only for board meetings and members meetings. Other activities, ONCA doesn't specify that it has to happen at that address. Other activities can happen at whatever address. Yeah, even outside of Ontario.
Thank
But there
you.
may be other laws that apply. Yeah. So thank you for that question. So being mindful of the time, I'm just going to quickly show you that this website exists. So it's nonprofitlaw.cleo.on.ca. If you go to the section, there's more detail run a nonprofit for everything we've talked about here today. If you're using the Interact Bylaw Builder, which allows you to create ONCA compliant bylaws from scratch, and we also have a guide to how to adjust existing bylaws. So if you don't want to create new bylaws, you just want your bylaws and to see where to make changes here and there, we have a guide that does a side-by-side comparison of typical provisions, and then how does ONCA treat those typical provisions to identify where you might want to make changes. The last thing I will say in closing, and I'll put in the chat, is my email address. We give out legal information, not legal advice, but please feel free to send me an email if you have questions. And I will close with that.
And we'll also be sending around an email to everyone who attended with some details, and we'll be sure to get the contact information in there as well.
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. Sorry I went over a couple of minutes. Thank you to everyone for attending and for your questions. I'm happy to stay on if people have other questions.
Are there any other questions for Benjamin? Do you see any, Benjamin?
I do not.
Okay, thank you. Well, if there are no other questions, then I would just like to thank Benjamin very, very much. You did so much work to make this clear and understandable to people, and it was an incredibly valuable session. As we've mentioned, it will be available as a recording on our website. Gabe will be sending information about that around, and you can always call Benjamin at CLEO or go to the CLEO website. You can also call EC3 if you get partway down the road and you're looking for some help to find other resources or some wordsmithing. We can do that through our Fuse service. And I'd like to also take a minute to thank our funders, particularly the City of Peterborough, the Ontario Arts Council, Canadian Heritage, the Community Foundation of Greater Peterborough, and the DBIA. Benjamin gave some really beautiful land acknowledgements that respond to where he is, and I'd like to wrap up the day by giving the local land acknowledgements. We're here today on the lands of the Treaty 20 Mississauga territory and the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. Collectively, they're known as the Williams Treaty First Nations, and they include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog, Rama, Beausoleil, and Georgina First Nations. The Williams Treaty people have been the caretakers and keepers of this land for time immemorial. We want to honor that and recognize that, thank them for the work they do to preserve the land for us, and to commit ourselves at EC3, and I'm sure I speak for most arts organizations in the city, to carry on our journey towards truth and reconciliation in all the work we do. So thank you very much to all of the First Nations that are part of the Treaty 20 territory. And if that's it, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming. Don't hesitate to call. Gabe, am I forgetting anything?
I think that's everything.
Thanks again to Gabe and to Benjamin. Good luck to all of you, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.